Dobry wieczór всем. Welcome to the August session of Meet a Poet from the American Center in Moscow. If you're a regular viewer of Meet a Poet, welcome back. And if you're new, we're so glad to have you. This month, we're really happy to be hosting Allison Joseph as our Poet of the Month. Before getting into Allison's background, I just wanted to explain how the session is going to work. For about half of the session, Allison is going to read her work and talk about her inspiration behind each poem along the way. And then I will be jumping back in and we're going to transition into a Q&A session. For the Q&A, I have some questions prepared, but I was also hoping that the audience could chime in. So we're going to be looking at all of the social platforms on VK and YouTube and such. And feel free to add your questions in the chat and I will ask Allison. So without further ado, I'll provide a little background and we can get started. So Allison is the director of the MFA Program in Creative Writing at Southern Illinois University. She was born in London, but she spent most of her time growing up in Toronto and in the Bronx in New York City. And her work has been nominated for and won a number of prestigious poetry awards, including the Feathered Quill Book Awards, the NAACP Image Awards, and the Da Vinci Eye Book Award. So we're so happy to have Allison with us today. Welcome.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. So very honored. And thank you to the American Center in Moscow for providing this forum for poets. We poets often get overlooked. So I am so thrilled to be part of this series. So should I just dive into reading?
Yeah, let's get the reading going.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to be reading this morning from a collection of mine published by the California publisher Red Hand Press. They are an excellent press. If you are a writer, look them up. They are located in Pasadena, California. And this book, Lexicon, was published in, I believe, 2021. So I'm going to read some poems, and some of my subjects as a poet are poetry itself. I often reflect on what it means to be a writer, to be a poet. I write about body image. I write about race relations. So you'll hear a little bit of all those topics this afternoon or this morning. So the first poem I'm going to read is the title poem for the collection. I conceived of Lexicon as a book about words. Lexicon. Let me taste the iams on your tongue. Stroke you so your trochees tumble free. Let me hear your anapestic pulse stutter through the rib cage I embrace, kissing every trimeter of skin. Hear me whisper sapphics in your ear, dangle dactyls from my curving lips. You're no mere versifier, but a bard, making all my consonants come hard. Vowels so elongated in lust, my mouth's an instrument of luscious praise. This poetry we make is evidence that all we touch is figurative, bodies pushing words beyond the real. Only I would come up with a poem that is a love poem that tries to teach people the terms of English versification. I'm a poet that writes equally in rhyme and in free verse. I think both positions are valid. Sometimes I'll write a poem in a fixed form, like the next poem. Sometimes I'll write a poem that looks like a prose paragraph. One of the things I really love about the freedom of poetry is that I can have restrictions in one poem and fewer restrictions in another. And this is something that I teach to my students all the time, that once you learn the whole gamut of techniques, you can write whatever you want. So this is a villanelle. Um, it's called If, When, Still. If no one hears you sob, would you still cry? If no one hears your cries, would you still weep? If no one hears you talk, do you still lie? When everything goes gray, no lows or highs, would you still walk upright or would you creep? If no one hears you sob, do you still cry? When all your messages get no replies, do you still write them down or choke them deep? If no one hears you talk, would you still lie? If no one heard you laugh or pray or sigh, would you still live your way or would you sleep? If no one hears you sob, would you still cry? If no one answers you, will you still try to write content with what you reap? If no one hears you talk, do you still lie? When no one's close to hear your alibis, would you still make them up, however cheap? If no one hears you sob, would you still cry? If no one hears you talk, do you still lie? That poem strikes me now that I look back at it. It's an interrogative poem, like practically every line is a question. And these are the questions that occupy my mind late at night, where I'm supposed to be sleeping and I'm thinking of these sorts of questions. Um, the power and the purity of loneliness, I guess. So, moving into the book, in the introduction, and thank you, Lucian, for that wonderful introduction. It was mentioned that I did most of my growing up in the New York City borough of the Bronx. And my parents were immigrants from two different Caribbean islands. My mother was from Jamaica. You can hear it come out when I say the word Jamaica. And my father was from an even smaller island called Grenada. And they met and married in London. They were part of what was called the Windrush generation of Caribbean people to the UK. And through a series of moves, we ended up in our house in the Bronx. I'm from the same neighborhood as Jennifer Lopez. J-Lo, shout out to J-Lo. So this was my childhood. Another childhood. Our kitchen smelled from frying fish. My mother wore her nursing shoes. My father made my sister wish she could escape our house, his rules. My mother wore her nursing shoes. My sister turned her music up. She could escape our house, his rules, that way. I dropped another cup. My sister turned her music up. My father yelled at her to shut it off right now. I dropped another cup. You clumsy child, my father scoffed. My father yelled at her to shut it off. My mother told him not to shout so loud. You nosy wife, my father scoffed. My mother lived mild, my father proud. My mother told him not to shout so loud. He'd raise his fist at her, he'd threaten wrath. My mother lived mild, my father proud. I'd struggle with my homework, hating math. My father called us worthless, stupid girls. My father made my sister wish for college far away, another world. Our kitchen smelled from frying fish. That particular poem is in a form called the pantoum, where lines 2 and 4 of one quatrain become lines 1 and 3 of the next. So that if you were sensing some repetition in that poem, And I used that form in that poem because those memories of childhood um, don't have a lot of variation for me. It's we all were slotted into these different roles in the family, and when I wrote the poem, I was recalling those roles. So one thing that occupies my mind, and since I'm a poetry teacher, where does creativity come from? How do you imagine the muse? What inspires you? If you're an artist or a painter or a singer or you're a craftsperson, what inspires you to keep going? And so this next poem is about how I conceptualize my muse. And my muse bears a distinct resemblance to the famous African American actress Pam Grier. If you remember the 1970s, everyone was afraid of Pam Grier because she was the baddest on the planet. So this is called My Muse. My muse wears thigh-high black leather boots, sports an 8-inch fro so thick she can hide razor blades in it, fingers nimble as she slices away weak lines, slack syllables, unredeemed cliches. She smells of cocoa butter, has skin the color of a Hershey's kiss, stomach firm without sit-ups. Stroking her sinuous waist, she dares me to write as well as she looks, her smile more wicked than I could ever be. When she speaks, she sings. When she sings, I stop, gape at her mouth, lips full, lightly pink. Unlike me, she's never been ashamed of them, of her wide nose, hands. She's not afraid of anything, anyone, but I'm afraid of her. What if I let her down, anger her, displease her with gooey sentiment, abstract diction? Patient thus far, she marches down the hallway to the kitchen to cut herself a slice of chocolate peanut butter pie. Says I can have some if I get down to business, write her something deserving such sweetness. She'd never be caught in polyester like I wore in grade school, seat of my pants snagging on wooden chairs. She's a clean-up woman, a stand-up woman who comes and goes as she pleases, the plate she holds out to me laden with what I want, have to earn. I'm working my way towards being more like my muse. I love that she has no modesty whatsoever, that she's just herself. And one thing that I constantly think about is the way beauty functions in our society for women primarily, for women and femmes, but also for men, like the things, the messages we keep getting. And as I was getting dressed for this session, I knew I'd only be seen from the shoulders up pretty much, but I was distressed because my stomach was poking out. It's totally normal for one's stomach to poke out, but we receive these messages from the greater culture all over the world too. It's like your stomach is something to control and get into shape. So this is called Ode to My Stomach. You are persistent. No matter the diet, the exercise, sit-ups, knee lifts, you still carry this flesh I am supposed to dislike, to whittle away until the muscles there lie flat and sculpted. A six-pack, hard enough to take a punch. When I close my jeans, the little metal button imprints itself on you, trying to rein you in, make you stay within boundaries of denim and stitching. You could grow and grow until you hang down past my knees, and I would have to gather you in my hands, shove you back in place. You want to be wide, to spread, to rise like yeasty bread. I cannot resist. You make me unpretty to others. You make me glad when I curl into myself to sleep, a soft swelling, warm in my hands as a baby, the baby that would make this stomach even wider, even less pretty. My tummy, my fat, my excess. I stroke lotion over you, skin under my fingertips, flesh under my fingertips. You might outlive me, belly in the afterlife, bulge in the beyond. I want to read a poem for my late husband. He wasn't deceased when I wrote this poem, and he did see it. But my husband passed away in 2019, right before the pandemic. And he was from Little Rock, Arkansas. His name was John Tribble. He was a poet. He published several books of poems during his lifetime. And where else would a girl from the Bronx meet a guy from Little Rock but Bloomington, Indiana? We met as graduate students at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. And we got married there on a cold December day, overcast, gray skies in Bloomington. And we were poor graduate students, so this was a trip to City Hall. It was not a fancy wedding. So this is about the dress that I wore that day, which wasn't an official wedding dress. It's called Ordinary Dress. I never cared for wedding gowns. Got married in purple and black, a dress with black buttons up and down. It hangs in my closet still, stuck in the back. Got married in purple with a black collar, long sleeves, hem right at my knee. It hangs in my closet still, stuck in the back. It's too tight now, too small for me. Collar, long sleeves, hem at my knee. Cloth too thin for Indiana winter, December. It's too tight now, too small for me. All I can do is remember. Cloth too thin for Indiana winter, December. Wind whipped it open. I had to pin it shut. All I can do is remember my sheer stockings and my trembling. When wind whipped it open, I had to pin it shut with a borrowed safety pin. My sheer stockings and my trembling made no difference to my future husband. Held together with a borrowed safety pin, I said vows I've since forgotten. Made no difference to my husband, who cares little about how fat I've gotten. I said vows I've since forgotten. Keep a dress with black buttons up and down. Don't care about how fat I've gotten. I'll never wear a wedding gown. So I've got two more poems for you. Here in the United States, we have poet laureates. We have the poet laureate of the United States, which is currently the spectacular poet Ada Limon. You might be familiar with Ada's work. And individual states can have poet laureates. In my state, the state of Illinois, the poet laureate is Angela Jackson, who is a poet, fiction writer, playwright. Even towns can have poet laureates. The job of a poet laureate is to glorify poetry for people who might not think poetry is glorious. And I'll confess here, be honest, I have wanted to be a poet laureate of something for a long, long time. When Angela Jackson was chosen, I was a runner-up. So I didn't even get a sash. And this next poem pokes fun at the concept of a poet laureate, but also the secret behind it is I really want to be, we often poke fun at what we want to be, right? So I really want to be a poet laureate of something someday. Maybe I wasn't even a poet laureate of my own house because my husband was a poet, so it was the two of us. This is called Laureate. He might say something wise enough to print. She might make poetry more popular than shin splints or those gobs of pocket lint inside your washed out jeans. He might just bore assemblies of the 1st or 7th grades. She might disrobe and leave us all in shock. He might not want to be here, but you paid for all his expertise, his wit, his stock, responses to the questions asked each time. Why write? Why poetry? Why not real books? Can what you've read be poetry? Sans rhyme? She might be thinking of her faded looks, her sad visage poetic, but not for words. He might be drunk right now, all visions blurred. Okay, I'm going to close with a poem dedicated to cravings. I always say to my students, if you are having a hard time thinking of a subject to write about food. Write about food, because food is family, food is culture, food is memory, food is just about, and we all have relationships with food. Some of us have great relationships with food. Some of us have, thorny relationships with food, but there's always going to be subject matter there. Even if you just write about the most fantastic meal you've ever had. Ravenous. I want chocolate all over my fingers, melted and smooth, so I cannot resist licking the tip of each finger as my palm's heat melts the candy. I want popcorn with real butter, popped in a pan, not a microwave, salt sprinkled on each kernel, not settling to the bottom of the bowl. I want cheese, not processed cheese food, but real cheese, Monterey, Jack, and Gouda, Edam, and cheddar, entire wheels of brie, melting and waiting for my cracker. I want crackers. I want to crush my crackers with my fists and leave a mess I won't clean up until tomorrow. A profusion of dirty dishes cooked in pots, bowls with cake batter clinging inside. I don't want anything steamed or light or low fat. I don't want to eat healthy choice meals, taking them from their hideous green boxes and dumping them in the trash instead, jeering the tiny portions that look nothing like the meals on the boxes. I don't care if my arteries clog with fatty sludge. Tonight, I want grease and fat and salt, real granules of real sugar, no equal or sweet and low for this tongue, this hungry body, ravenous mouth. Thanks so much for listening.
Perfect. That was a great way to close out. Thank you so much, Allison.
I always have to end with food.
Yeah. No, I love that as an ending. That makes me hungry for lunch. So I have a few questions here. And again, I just wanted to encourage our audience in YouTube, VK, etc. We're looking at those chats. So if you have any comments or questions for Allison, please leave them and I'll read them to her and we can talk about them. But I got a few questions of my own to start out with. I wanted to start with, you just read a couple poems ago, you read Laureate and talked about that whole thing. And you also talked in the beginning of the session about, that you were glad to be in a place that values poetry and poets, which this very much is. And I would say Russia as a whole is a place that probably values poetry and poets more than the average country, which is a very
Right.
good quality, I think. But I wanted to ask you in a general sense, with all of that in mind, what your thoughts are on the role of the poet in like society today in general, and how that's evolved over your lifetime and stuff.
What's great about being a poet is that your role can be adapted to suit your community. So one of the things that is great about all these different poet laureates in states and towns is that we can bring poetry to a community that needs it. We can do, particularly, I've worked a lot over the course of my career with youth. I'm very much interested in promoting poetry among young people. And perhaps that's because I became a poet when I was around 11, 12. I'd always been the sort of kid who was enchanted by words, always did better in my math classes than my English classes. I mean, my English classes than my math classes. Let's get that right. I do partially blame growing up in New York for my becoming a poet for a couple of reasons. One is there is an institute, there is a not institution, organization called Poets in the Schools, and it began in New York City. I believe it did begin in New York City. And so I remember being like in third grade and these people coming to my classroom, and they were called poets. And we got to stop whatever it was, if we were doing math or whatever it was, we were able to stop doing what we were doing and talk about poetry. So that's one reason. Another reason is any New Yorker will tell you that one of the great advantages of being in that city is the New York public library system. So I would go to the library and get poetry books, and a library card would enable me to read all sorts of poets from all sorts of places. So I blame New York in a lot of ways. Also, I blame my own cultural background. Being from West Indian people, Caribbean people, if you've ever gone to a party with West Indian people, they have the art of storytelling down pat. My own father, who I had a contentious relationship with, you can see in the another childhood poem that there's a lot of tension within the family. But my own father was an amazing storyteller and had this sense of character. A poem that I didn't read, but a poem about him. He's giving nicknames to every child on the street that I grew up on, and I didn't know this was a literary technique until many years later. It's like, but naming people, giving them a nickname that has to do with some aspect of their character or appearance is such a literary technique. So I was kind of bound to be a poet. But in terms of poetry, in the general cultural sense, you can pair it with anything. You can pair it with music. You can pair it with, there's an art called poetry therapy that people sort of recapture memories through poetry. You can pair poetry with psychology. You can pair poetry with art history. So there's so many ways that poetry itself can be adapted. It can be very much a performance art. It can be very much written for the page. It can be written for the stage. We've got Shakespeare. And I always point out to students that Shakespeare was first and foremost a poet. You think of him as a playwright, but there's poetry all throughout all those plays, all those famous speeches that we can remember from Shakespeare. So what I love about being a poet at this cultural moment is that I can shape the way I want my own personal poetry to affect the world, but I can also shape through teaching and lecturing and traveling the way people view poetry. I've had a lot of people come up at my readings and say, I never liked poetry, but I liked yours. I mean, that's very flattering, but it also means that they've had this cultural notion implanted somewhere along the way that poetry is impenetrable and poetry is something that they couldn't access. So if a poet like me comes to a high school or comes to some sort of public arena and reads poems that are accessible and employs all sorts of different techniques, if I create other poets, then I feel like I've done my job.
That's great. Yeah, and the teaching role is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
You get to do that all the time. You're teaching all your classes this fall.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of going off of that, I had this other question. You talked at the beginning about working around kind of self-imposed limitations and structures like that. And I was wondering if you could go a little deeper into how you teach your students about that and what advice you might have for aspiring poets in the audience about
Right.
self-imposed limitations.
Well, we have so many artistic choices when we study poetry. We can write poems that are prose. I do believe prose poetry is an actual thing. We can write poems that are in strict familiar meters, iambic pentameter, for example. We can write sonnets. We can write poems that rhyme. We can write poems that have refrains. So I love having all this variety to choose from, because for me, art's about taking experience and using craft, artistic choices, to create something that didn't exist before. It's funny, in my undergraduate class just yesterday, we were starting to talk about the students' work, and a student had written, my first assignment for my students was write a self-portrait. So that's what they're working on. And we've been sharing self-portraits from different poets, and we started examining their work. And a student, they had a poem that basically said, "I'm not a poet." And I stood in front of the classroom. We were looking at the poem on a sort of projected screen. And I just kept pointing out all the different poetic strategies they had used. Oh, here's where you're using alliteration. Here's where you're using internal rhyme. Here's where you're using figurative language. Here's a simile. Here's a metaphor. So the student was aware of the irony of writing a poem in which they claim to be a non-poet, but using all these poetic strategies. And I even pointed out some ones that they weren't aware that they had used. So I love to tell people that you can always learn something new about this particular art form. You can practice a new technique. You can read a poet who doesn't write anything like you, but find something within it, not to necessarily imitate, but to be inspired by. There's a difference in my mind between inspiration and imitation. Imitation, you're sort of slavishly trying to copy. Imitation means you're sort of saying, I want to duplicate this. But inspiration means, wow, I've just read the best Frank O'Hara poem, and Frank O'Hara writes these conversational and funny poems. Let me try a conversational and funny poem. I usually don't write funny poems. I mean, I often do, but this person's interior monologue. Let me try this. So what I love about poetry and what I love about being able to teach poetry is to tell people that they can locate themselves within the art wherever they want, and then grow in different directions.
That's great. And I love the idea of the difference between imitation and inspiration. I think there's kind of a false perception in poetry and in the arts in general that like true creative people, just everything comes from within their own mind and genius or whatever. And it's like, no, look at forms of what people around you are doing. As long as you're not imitating, there's a lot of room for growth there. So it's a cool idea.
Well, sometimes you do imitate when you want to learn a particular skill. You just sort of practice. And I tell my students, okay, I'm making you write a sonnet for practice. This doesn't have to be the most profound sonnet ever written. I'm just teaching you how to do this. So when you do have something profound to say, you know what container to put it in. And you know how this particular form expresses what you want to say. You know, a sonnet is 14 lines, may or may not. When I write a sonnet, I always have a rhyme scheme, even if it's very subtle. But you're participating in part of the culture. You're reaching back. You're reaching back to Shakespeare. You're reaching back to Edna St. Vincent Millay. You're sort of participating in a party that you didn't even have to wait to be invited to. So there is a room for imitation. But I think the growth of an artist means you move from the imitative pieces that you're sort of practicing and learning on to being inspired and knowing what your inspirations are. So as a writer, I do not believe in writer's block. I don't believe in it. I think it was the poet and writer William Stafford who said, if you're having writer's block, just lower your aim.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bring yourself down, and you will find something to write about.
It's a good piece of advice for everyone out there. So when you were like, you were a teenager or whatever, checking books out of the New York Library, who were the people who you were inspired by or like to imitate? Who were those poets for you?
Well, I can show you because I turned to this book. This was an early book for me. It's called Trouble the Water. It's 250 years of African American poetry. It was edited by Jerry W. Ward Jr. And if you're interested in poetry, in particularly the history of African American poetry in this country, this book, which came out, let's see, the copyright was 97. So it may not have been this book. I wonder if this book has been printed in different versions. But there were many books like this, The Black Poets, Celebrations. I started with anthologies of African American poetry because I wanted to understand, where I came from and who were the poets who engaged some of these subjects before me. And this book is $6.99, so you can't beat it.
Good. Yeah.
$8.99 if one is in Canada. But I began with poets like Langston Hughes. That he was always a favorite, and I teach him to this day because he's a poet that is scalable. You can teach Langston Hughes to third graders. You can teach Langston Hughes to high schoolers. You can teach Langston Hughes to college students. You can teach Langston Hughes to graduate students. I have done all of those because he was a poet, a writer. He wrote for newspapers. He was a translator, translated the most famously the Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen, playwright. So a poet like that sticks with you when you discover them. The great thing about being a poetry reader, even if you don't write poetry, but the great thing about being a poetry reader and appreciator of poetry is that you grow along with the poets that you read. And it may be that you encounter a poet for the first time and you're like, I don't understand what's going on. I don't get it. I was like that for a long time with Allen Ginsberg. I just didn't get it. It seemed like ranting to me. And until I had to study and teach him in a class that was all about poetic forefathers and foremothers and poetic movement. So we were looking at the beats. And I understood for the first time teaching him recently, okay, this is definitely coming from a couple of sources, American jazz and the Beatitudes. And this is what it comes from, filtered through a Jewish man becoming Buddhist. Yeah. So it takes a while sometimes for a poet to sink in with you, for you to understand what they're doing. And many of us are taught that the way to judge poetry is whether we like it or we don't like it. I try to move my students away from that sort of judgment to see well, what's really going on here? What's the cultural moment in these poems are being written in? What is this poet responding to? That appreciation and just liking something are two different things in my mind, at least.
No, that's interesting about your development of your relationship with certain poets. When you're teaching different poets in your classes, you mentioned Langston Hughes. Which other poets do you find that students really respond to, that they really get something out of?
Interestingly enough, for many years, this particular poet was out of favor. People thought she was old-fashioned, that she didn't have much to say to current generations. Edna St. Vincent Millay, who is another sonneteer, probably one of my favorite sonneteers. But her poems about love and relationships are kind of at this fever pitch, and maybe not the healthiest relationships being depicted in the poems, but I find that my students, particularly my women and my femme students, really relate to the speaker in her poems. That this expression of wanting freedom in the midst of a society that feels confining is that's a universal theme throughout literature. And but I've taught so many different poets. I try to when I teach classes, teach a mixture of modern, contemporary living poets and classic poets from all sorts of traditions. And I have to give a shout out to poetry translators, because Spanish is barely my second language. So I can read a little Garcia Lorca and make sense of it if I'm reading the Spanish in its original. But I really need someone who's able to translate it into English and get the real heart of it on the page. So shout out to translators. And Gabriela Mistral is another poet that I love to teach, because here is a person who was a school teacher for many years, who won the Nobel Prize. What an amazing story. What an amazing life. Someone who was encouraged by Pablo Neruda. Just amazing. There are amazing poets throughout history. So I have some issues with just teaching poets of the past, and I have issues with just teaching poets of the present. I think we need a mix. I think we need to know where we came from and where we're going. But some of my favorite contemporary poets have been on this program. We talked about Major Jackson before we got on the air, and he's an amazing poet and editor.
Yeah, people definitely shouldn't forget about the contemporary poetry going on now.
And there are so many amazing contemporary poets. And what happens is, with poets, once we get a foothold in poetry, we start sneaking into other genres. So if you look at someone like Amy Nes-Hukumatatil, who is an amazing poet, and I've known Amy for many years. Right now, people know her as a nonfiction writer because she's published several books of nonfiction that have been very successful. But you can see the beginnings of what she's interested in as a writer in the poems, because she's writing in her poems a lot about nature, a lot about food, a lot about family, and those same topics end up in her nonfiction prose. So that's another thing I swear to my students, because I get a lot of students and they're like, I'm not really a poet. I write stories. I want to write game programs for computers. I'm like, you can be those things, but you can also be a poet. And writing poetry fits very neatly alongside any other creative endeavor. I know poets who are also novelists, who are also short fiction writers, who are also playwrights. Poetry can sort of occupy if it's not your main thing, and for me, poetry has always been the main thing. Whenever I venture, and I've written nonfiction and fiction, but whenever I venture over there, poetry is like, what do you think you're doing, young lady? Come back here. Sit right here. There are poems you need to write. So, but I do love the fact that so many of the folks that I know write in different genres and various genres.
It's kind of like you say in Laureate, the why write, why poetry, why not real books?
Yeah, which I'm sure everyone who does a public performance as a poet faces that question. People are like, well, if you really had something to say, wouldn't you write it as nonfiction? Wouldn't you, write a real book about this topic? Why are you messing around with poetry? But it's the other thing is when there is a moment of cultural crisis, what do people turn to? They turn to poetry and they turn to music. I remember long ago during 9/11, and it was when MTV still actually showed music videos, they stopped all regular programming and just played Bob Marley songs because they wanted something to soothe people. They, during the pandemic, a lot of us poets got online because we couldn't meet and commune together. And a lot of us shared poetry about that experience. So I always, and when someone dies, there's usually a call for elegies. When someone gets married, people like to have a poem. I remember that that Auden poem became popular because it was in 4 weddings and a funeral. So it's interesting that people are like, yeah, poetry, well, I can take it or leave it. But that there be some crisis happen, and they're asking us to talk about it.
Yeah. Why do you think that is, that people gravitate towards poetry in particular during those times?
I think it's because poetry has the advantage of compression. So 14 lines can initiate a marriage. When we want to talk about the deep hurt of losing someone we love, sometimes it's easier in the compressed format of a poem as opposed to something long and rambling. And young people get it because I have been at funeral situations where the youngest person in the family has written a poem. Maybe the kid doesn't even think of themselves as a poet, but it just naturally occurs to them, if they're going to say goodbye to their grandfather, they're going to write a poem. If they're going to say goodbye to their uncle, their auntie. So I think it's the compression of the form, the way the form moves us through so many different emotional spheres within something that's fairly compact. Now, don't get me wrong, I love fiction, I love nonfiction, I am a musical theater geek. I love going to see people sing on stage in the middle of the plot. The thing that bothers a lot of people about musical theater, it's like, and the story was moving along and they stopped to sing. I'm like, that's glorious, that's wonderful. But with poetry, even, I have spent in class a half hour talking about Ezra Pound's and the Station of the Metro, which is 3 lines. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. It's just a couple lines, and we spent a whole half hour talking about this poem. So I think it's really the compression, the way poetry gets to the heart of emotion in a quick way and moves you toward epiphany really fast, moves you toward some sort of realization, whether that realization is painful or exhilarating or what have you.
That's great. You were earlier in that question, you were talking as well about kind of the relationship of poetry and music side by side, and that tied into another pre-prepared question I had about another childhood, which is obviously a pretty heavy poem about like the tensions in your house growing up, but it also made me wonder what music your sister was listening to escape, like you were talking about.
Oh yeah. So I'm Gen X, and my sister's a little bit older than me. So she's what they call Gen Jones. Like technically it's part of the baby boomer generation, but they are way too young to be baby boomers. My sister's the same age, I believe, as Vice President Harris. So there I was, a kid, stealing her records, and Earth, Wind and Fire, The Spinners, LaBelle, Brothers Johnson. So late 70s funk and soul. And my father, even though he was this black man from Grenada, he thought that was noise. He liked two types of music. He liked classical music. So my classical music education came from him. And I was always puzzled by this, like why a man from this Caribbean background would embrace classical music so much. And also he liked American blues. He liked Muddy Waters. He Robert Johnson. So I just found that really interesting that he loved blues, but he didn't like uh, what we would call like music that you would hear on Soul Train in 1978.
Yeah.
Which I love all those types of music, and I've incorporated more and more music in the classes that I teach, particularly blues, because blues has a structure that is poetic. That if you listen to a standard blues song, you'll have one line and then a variation on that line that is a repetition, and then you'll have a different line, and they'll all be chained by rhyme. So my students get to hear Robert Johnson and Albert King and BB King and those players in my um, in the spring. I usually teach a class that combines poetry and music, where we talk about the relationships between what does it mean that blues came out of African American migration from the deep South to the urban North, to places like Chicago. And many of my students, since my university is in Illinois, many of my students are from Chicago and have been hearing Sweet Home Chicago their whole lives. It's like, do you know the story of that song? Where did it come from? It wasn't written by someone from Chicago. It was written by someone who came to Chicago. So I just see tendrils everywhere when I'm talking about poetry. It's not sort of this abstract thing all by itself.
That sounds great. I would take that music and poetry class in a heartbeat. That sounds fun.
It is fun. And
do you think there's a line there? I guess it's interesting you bringing up like BB King or something, and like looking at that through the lens of poetry. Do you think there's a line between like musical lyricism and poetry, or is it all kind of intertangled?
Well, this is a question a lot of poets debate all the time.
Yeah.
Can musical lyrics without the music, because music has its own emotional appeal. You can listen to an instrumental piece and be moved to tears, no words. So when you pair music with words, do songs have an advantage? Well, I understand all aspects of that argument. And where I come down is that there are songwriters who intend for the words to be as powerful as the music. And one person that I always point to is American treasure Paul Simon.
Yes.
That Paul Simon, in many of his songs, tells a whole story, and that you could isolate the lyrics from the music and analyze it as a poem. Are there hip hop artists that do this? Yeah, there's a reason why Kendrick Lamar is the first hip hop artist to win the Pulitzer Prize.
That was a big deal.
Would I say this about Lil Jon? No. Do I love some Lil Jon just to dance with myself at home? Yes, but we're not going to take a Lil Jon song and analyze it, because there's not going to be much meat on the bone. So I kind of come down on the middle, that it really depends on the songwriter's intention. Another person that I have brought into poetry classes as a songwriter whose work we can analyze as poetry is Suzanne Vega, who is a good Barnard graduate. So you look through her work and there are all sorts of classical references, literary references. And yeah, I can teach her alongside Sylvia Plath. So that would be, I like to look for combinations and artists that sort of play off one another. And Vega and Plath, that's one of my go-tos.
What musicians would you pair with your own poetry?
That's an interesting thing, because when you're a writer, you're your own worst critic. So who would I pair my work with? I know what poets that I'm constantly seeing myself in conversation with, and I've mentioned a lot of them this afternoon. But I'm not sure. I haven't thought about my work in a musical context. I've written poems that respond to songs, and both Paul Simon and Suzanne Vega have inspired poems for me. But I don't know if there's an artist, a single artist that I would say that I'm the poetic equivalent of. But that's a good question. I'll have to think about that.
No, yeah, it's fun to think about for sure. Good. Well, time has flown by here. We're coming up towards the end. So before we wrap, I just wanted to ask in a general sense, we have a lot of aspiring poets who watch the program, and I was wondering if you had any parting words of advice for them and all that.
Well, I became a poet because I read, wrote, and admired poetry, which you can do entirely on your own and by yourself. But it is good for a poet's mental health to be in communion with other poets. So, I would say seek out opportunities to read and share work with other poets, whether it's, establishing an open mic at a community center in your community, or going to a workshop or a conference. And we are blessed in the United States that we have so many different conferences at different price points. And I have the honor of working with several poets every summer at a conference called Poetry by the Sea, which is held every May in Madison, Connecticut. It was founded by an amazing woman who is no longer with us. We miss her so much, Kim Bridgeford, who was a poet who founded this amazing conference at a place called Mercy by the Sea, which is a retreat center. So it's a perfect place for poets. So there are all sorts of opportunities to be in communion with other poets, to learn from other poets, to hear other poets. So I would say the first step is to read and write and think about poetry. But the other part of it, at least for me, is I need to be in communion with other poets. I need to talk to other people who find this pursuit as vital and as interesting as I do. I'm kind of a poetry evangelist. What can I say?
Nice. No, that's what we like to hear. That's great. Good. With that, I think we'll wrap up the session. Thank you so much for everyone who attended, and we hope to see you at next month's session, which is going to be with Chris Santiago, who is also great. So thank you so much, Allison, and we'll see you later.
Thank you for having me. Yay! All right. Thank you. Really, thank you for, I know I've